Hello and welcome back to a new video. Today we are looking at CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. It is one of the most discussed approaches in applied linguistics and language education, but it is often misunderstood or reduced to a simple formula. Today, at its core, CLIL has got a double goal. Students learn subject matters, history, biology, geography, and they develop proficiency in an additional language at the same time. But here is what is important. CLIL is not a language lesson that uses content as a pretext, and it is not a content lesson that happens to be delivered in another language. The integration is supposed to be genuine and intentional. The term CLIL was coined in the mid-1990s, largely in the European context by David Marsh and Anne Maliers, as a way to describe and systematize what was already happening in many bilingual education programs across the continent. The most influential theoretical framework for CLIL is Coyle's 4C model. This model identifies four interconnected dimensions that any CLIL program should address. The first is content, the subject matter itself, the concepts, skills, and knowledge students are expected to acquire. The second is communication, and this is important, not language as a system to be studied, but language as it is actively used to think, discuss, and construct knowledge. The third dimension is cognition, the higher order thinking skills involved in meaningful learning, analyzing, evaluating, synthesizing, solving problems, and so on. The first is culture, an awareness that knowledge and communication are never neutral, they're always situated in a cultural and intercultural context. What makes this framework theoretically significant is the insistence that these four dimensions work together. So the integration is meant to be holistic. One of the theoretically interesting things about CLIL is how it is conceptualizing language itself. Coyle, Hood, and Marsh distinguish three layers of language demand that operate simultaneously in a CLIL classroom. Language of learning refers to the subject-specific vocabulary and structures needed to access the content, the disciplinary terminology, the genre of conventions of a particular field. The language for learning is about what students need to actually participate in classroom interaction, how to argue a point, compare two positions, and so on. These first two layers are relatively predictable and can be planned for. The third layer, language through learning, is where things get theoretically interesting. This is the emergent, unpredictable language development that arises as a student engages deeply with content. The claim is that when students are cognitively challenged by meaningful material, language acquisition happens as a byproduct of what is this engagement producing. This connection brings clear to a broader debate in second language acquisition. It is about the relationship between meaning-focused activity and formal language development. And it's a claim that has generated both support and skepticism in the research literature. CLIL doesn't emerge from a theoretical vacuum. It draws explicitly on several well-established frameworks in applied linguistics. From Krashen, it takes the idea that acquisition happens through comprehensible input, meaningful exposure at the right level of challenge, what Krashen calls I+1. The content classroom, in this view, is an ideal environment for sustained conceptualized input. From Vygotsky, CLIL borrows the concept of zone of proximal development. Learning is a scaffolded social process, not individual memorization, and the teacher's role is to support students in reaching beyond what they could do alone. From Cummins comes perhaps the most directly relevant contribution, the distinction between BICS and CALP. Basic interpersonal communicative skills are the conversational fluency we develop relatively quickly in a new language within 2 or 3 years of exposure. Cognitive academic language proficiency, by contrast, is a deeper, more abstract register of academic language, the kind needed to read a textbook or write an argument. CLIL takes much longer to develop, often 5 to 7 years, and is precisely this that CLIL claims to target. No theoretical framework is without tension, and CLIL, of course, is no exception. It is worth being explicit about where the unresolved questions lie. The first concerns scaffolding. Providing linguistic support is necessary, especially at the early stage. But how much scaffolding is appropriate before it starts to reduce the cognitive challenge that is supposed to drive acquisition in the first place? The second tension concerned language policy and classroom reality. A growing body of literature, including work on translanguaging, shows that students and teachers use their full multilingual repertoire in CLIL classrooms, regardless of what the official policy says. But many CLIL models implicitly or explicitly assume a single target language. How these two things are reconciled theoretically is another open question. Third, there are serious equity concerns. CLIL programs are frequently selective. They tend to abstract and retain higher achieving, more socially advantaged students. If CLIL delivers better outcomes, partly because of who participate in it, rather than because of the model itself, that has significant implication for how we interpret the research evidence, and of course also for policy decisions. And finally, assessment. How do you evaluate whether a student has understood the content of a biology lesson when their written response is constrained by their language proficiency? Do you assess them on content, on language, or on both simultaneously? And to conclude, some theoretical implications and future ideas for research. Thank you very much for having watched this video. Stay tuned for more.